Hello, this is Luna Bird Book Club. My name's Kathy and I've spent the last year reading Tolkien books. For 2025, one of my reading goals was to do a deep dive on Tolkien. I should probably explain in case you haven't come across the term before. I'm going to put these down because they're heavy. An author deep dive. I originally found out about this kind of idea from a blog and I think about 2016. It's the Cupcakes and Cashmere blog. It might be Cashmere and Cupcakes, something like that. Anyhow, and on this blog the writer explained how she likes to do deep dive on authors, which is where you try and read a wide sample of that author's work, maybe read a biography about them, maybe watch some of film or TV adaptations of their works, and just spend some time like just focusing on one author. And I really like that idea. So in the past I've done deep dives on Shirley Jackson and on C.S. Lewis, and I really enjoyed doing those, but for 2025 I thought I'll do Tolkien. The advantage of doing a deep dive is that it's kind of a way of doing studying without having to write the essays, and you get to find out a lot more about an author and their work and a bit more about their influences, and often one thing leads to another. So learning about one author and what they wrote about and what they were influenced by and like their context of writing often like helps you create links to other books and other literary movements. So it's quite a nice way to kind of lightly study literature without being fully into study mode. And if it's an author you like, you just tend to find out a lot of interesting stuff about them. So for 2025 I decided to do a Tolkien deep dive because The Lord of the Rings is a really important trilogy to me. I've loved the books since I was very young. I love the films. I've loved nearly all the adaptations that there are out there. It's just a story that I find comforting and inspiring, and I know that Tolkien actually wrote a vast amount of work over his lifetime, and I've always found him quite interesting. So yeah, I wanted to spend a year with Tolkien. And now that it's nearly end of the year, I kind of just want to share with you what books I read, what I kind of learned about him, anything that I found particularly interesting, and kind of do a Tolkien deep dive wrap up. I'll say that it was a lot of fun and I'm really glad I did this. The first book that I read in my Tolkien deep dive I don't actually have with me because I got it from the library, but that was J.R.R. Tolkien, a biography by Humphrey Carpenter. This was a really good biography, and it was really nice to start the deep dive by learning a bit more about Tolkien as a person and kind of get a wider perspective on him before diving into his books. The things that I learned from the biography that I found really interesting was one, the story of him and his wife and how they met and how much they loved one another. So Tolkien and his brother were orphaned when they were adolescents. So their father died, I think, when they were quite young, and then their mother passed away when the boys were like early teenagers. They had some wider extended family, and I think they got moved around a little bit from place to place, but they ended up going to a boarding house and kind of being looked after by a landlady there. And at that boarding house was Tolkien's future wife, Edith. So Edith was living in the same boarding house as Tolkien and his brother, and she also was, I think, in her late teens, and her family had also passed away, so she was also an orphan living on her own in kind of this in-between stage of life. And Tolkien and Edith fell in love in the boarding house. They kept their relationship secret for a couple of years and got secretly engaged, and then they were found out by one of Tolkien's guardians, who was also a priest, and the priest said that you're too young to marry, and told them to wait until Tolkien had finished at university, once he'd got his education, and then if they still wanted to marry, they could, is what this priest like quite firmly told them to do. So they had a few years of separation, but once Tolkien's degree kind of got stretched out longer, so they had to wait quite a long time. And then after the degree, Tolkien went back, found Edith and proposed again, and then they got married and they went on to have 4 children and were together the rest of their lives. Tolkien kind of writes about Edith and about finding her as his new family at a time when they were both grieving. And just the idea of finding somebody and falling in love with them that young, and actually it being the love that lasts the rest of your life. I found that really, really moving. And I think that shows a bit in Lord of the Rings, where when Tolkien does write about love and romantic love, that's how he tends to write about it. He was never interested in the will they, won't they romantic relationships, or being conflicted, not really knowing which person to go for. I guess Eowyn has a bit of that. But when Tolkien writes about the romance he believes in, he writes about love that lasts, and love that isn't double-minded or indecisive. And I think that came from his own love story, and I think that's really, really beautiful. The other thing that kind of came out when I was reading this biography is that just how much Tolkien poured himself into his work and how expansive it was, and how he struggled all of his working life to accomplish the things he wanted to accomplish, because there were so many demands on his time as a professor, as a teacher, and as a writer. You know, he had his academic work, he had his creative work, he had his teaching work, he had his family, he had, you know, been committed to the Catholic faith. He had all of these commitments, and his friendship group too, which was really important to him. And on one hand you can look at that and go, oh, what a great full life, but in his writings and the way that he struggled to get his projects finished, like it took 16 years to write Lord of the Rings, that actually is quite stressful, and he found that stressful and found that hard work to have all these interruptions in what he wanted to do, and he was quite distracted and would get focused on tiny little details when he had deadlines piling up around him. You know, he felt a lot of pressure, and that comes out in a few of his works as well, that feeling of not being able to get things done, and being overwhelmed by the workload and the ambition and the scope of what he set out to achieve. When you read about how all of that went, you think no wonder he left us with such a great detailed world that people are still getting lost in, because he poured so much effort and work into it. And I think it really shows, and I'm glad that we still value his work enough to explore all that work and effort he put in. The other thing that came out in the biography is that because of the time of history that Tolkien lived through, he saw a huge amount of change in the 20th century. And part of that change was the modernisation of England. And one of the things that distressed him was seeing rural spots from his childhood modernised and given away to roads and housing estates, and losing countryside and beautiful picturesque spots being changed into what he often viewed as like quite ugly modernisations. And this biography said that although Tolkien really lamented the loss of old trees and idyllic spots, he was never a nature activist. There was something quite stoic and accepting of change and loss. So he never went out and campaigned for nature, but he lamented its loss from our country. And I think that also comes across in Lord of the Rings, in like the scouring of the Shire, and the story of the Ents. And there is a sense of sadness that infiltrates a lot of Tolkien's works, where there's the idea of something has been lost and like a growing acceptance of that, but then there's still this kind of hope for renewal, but that's beyond worldly means. I think that's part of Tolkien's faith in there, of believing this world is fallen, but God is good, and there is hope in heaven and beyond. I found it interesting to learn more about Tolkien, and then see how his outlook and his experiences and his history influenced the works that he made. Once I'd read that, I first dived into some old favourites and comforting stories to me, which were The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So I've read these books many, many times. I really, really enjoy them. I read The Hobbit to Orla. She really enjoyed it too. So rereading The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, it's really hard for me to talk about these objectively, because I love these stories so much. I find them really comforting and inspiring. I think on this reread, what struck me the most was the character of Frodo, who I mean, I could do a whole video just on Frodo. I feel like Frodo is really underappreciated. Part of it is to do with the films, so, and again, I love the films, no shade to the films whatsoever, I think they're magnificent, but they were constrained in time, if you can believe it, even though like the extended versions is like 9 hour long. But I think one of the constraints on the time is that Frodo's unique character gets watered down a bit, because in the books, Frodo is this middle-aged hobbit who has always longed to follow in his uncle's footsteps and have grand adventures, but was also quite comfortable staying in the Shire and could never quite make up his mind which way to go. And so he kind of studied maps and he studied languages and he dreamed of going on adventures, and he learnt how to talk in languages and like what we'd call like high manners. And then he's thrust into an adventure that soon becomes too big for him. Again, I think that connects a lot to Tolkien, who perhaps had hobbit tendencies in how he lived his life, but also had mythic and epic dreams. And those were the things that mattered to him. Myth and legend mattered to him, but he was still very much a homebody himself. So I think there's a lot of Tolkien in Frodo. And one of the cool things about Frodo in the books is that wherever he goes, he kind of wins people over by his polite manners, by his graceful talk. He's witty, he's articulate, he's gracious. And actually in some ways it's his like high manners that open the door for him to meet and connect with people to help him on his journey. I think that's quite a beautiful trait for a hero to have, and one that I hadn't noticed that much before. So yeah, on this reread of Lord of the Rings, I just felt a deeper appreciation for Frodo. We have done individual reviews for The Fellowship, Two Towers and Return of the King, so I'll try and link them down below, because we can talk all day about these, but I don't want to spend this whole video going over and over it, so I'm just highlighting Frodo stood out to me on this reread. After that, I read some works of Tolkien that I'd never read before in this book called Tree and Leaf. So Tree and Leaf is a collection of some of Tolkien's short pieces. So it includes a short story called Leaf by Nigel, where the character Nigel is trying to create a masterpiece painting of a tree. And he's determined to get every leaf just right, but he's going to so much detail that other interruptions keep coming and drawing him away from the work, and he has this great frustration at not being able to do his work. And then it starts off quite quaint and silly, and then Nigel ends up having to kind of go through a kind of purgatory experience where the belief of his artwork being his greatest work and legacy is severely questioned and put alongside the work he's done at just being a good neighbour to a rather grumpy old man who kept like needing his help. So really interesting short story. There's also an essay of Tolkien's that is called On Fairy Stories, which is like Tolkien's defence of writing fantasy as a genre and what that means and why it is important and why it should be a respected part of literature. There's also like a couple of poems in here. There's also in here a really like dramatic, it's kind of like a play or a drama or a poem. It's called The Homecoming of, I'm not going to pronounce this right, The Homecoming of Borothnoth, or something like that. It tells the story of two servants combing a battlefield full of dead bodies, looking for the dead body of their lord, who had just made a foolish decision in the last battle to kind of allow the enemy to assemble on higher ground in the name of like being a good sport, of being honourable, but then they got slaughtered. So as these two servants are searching for this body, they have a discussion on myths and ideals and how far myth and ideals can take you and when do you need to be a realist. So the idea that threads all these writings together is the idea of fantasy and myth and writing it. But I had a really cool experience reading this book because I happened to be reading this book when I was trying to, I'd gone away on a trip to Italy, and on the way back our flight got cancelled, and instead of flying from Bologna to Manchester as the original plan, we had to fly from Bologna to Dusseldorf, from Dusseldorf to Birmingham, and then get a coach from Birmingham to Preston, and then my dad picked me up to get me home. So it was a really, really long day of travelling and uncertainty and going to like different countries and all this different travel. But I mean, fortunately I was with my university at the time, so my university was taking care of the arrangements. I just had to go where I was told, sit where I was told to sit, and I had my book to read. So I kind of read Tolkien's thoughts on myth and epic and storytelling whilst, you know, flying over the Alps and flying across Europe, and it felt really strange and cerebral to be up in the air, very, very tired, a bit disorientated, reading this book. I remember a while ago in the 2000s there was a book called Zero Gravity Thinking, and the idea is like imagining that your brain was like on a plane and you just let go of all the things you think you know to like take on new ideas. And I definitely felt like I had that experience reading this book. I was really inspired by it, and I was left just feeling like I can't wait to start writing. My biggest struggle in my Tolkien challenge was definitely the Silmarillion. I have tried to read this book quite a few times in the past, and most of the time I have not gotten past the first chapter. I don't know why, but I find this book very, very difficult. So this time I was determined to get through the whole thing, but I decided to do it via audiobook so that at least pronouncing the strange names wouldn't be the thing that stopped me finishing the Silmarillion. So I listened to the audiobook read by Andy Serkis. He did an amazing job, and I did get through the whole thing, but I still found it a struggle even just listening to the audiobook. It's like the lost legends of Middle-earth is the Silmarillion, and I think I just found it quite confusing. I kept getting mixed up with character names and people names and place names, and it all got jumbled up in my head, and I kind of only really latched on here and there with certain stories. The stories of Beren and Luthien, Lutherian, is that how you say it? You know, the romantic man and elf couple who go on great adventures together and actually get hold of one of the Silmarils. That was really cool. I enjoyed that a lot. Other bits I really struggled with. The end is cool because it ties into Sauron and his story, and you get a little bit of Gandalf and Saruman, so I like those bits. But a lot of this is just it's just beyond me. This is Tolkien at too high a level for me to fully get hold of and connect with. But I tried, and I reached my limit, and I finished it, and I don't ever have to read it again. But you know what? I got through it. It was the challenging part of my Tolkien deep dive. I got through it. I think the things that I do appreciate in it is understanding the elves a bit more and their sadness and their role in Middle-earth, and kind of getting a picture of what they'd lost and why that they were leaving Middle-earth. Because I never really understood that. Reading Lord of the Rings, I never got why the time of the elves had to come to an end and what that was about. But reading the Silmarillion gives you a clearer picture that it's not just that they've had enough and they're going home, they're kind of righting a really ancient wrong by leaving, I think. I did really struggle to understand that, but that's my understanding of the Silmarillion, and I'm glad that I read it and it is done. After that, things took a turn towards the easy, and I read Farmer Giles of Ham and the Adventures of Tom Bombadil. This is a very nice, gentle collection. Farmer Giles of Ham is a fairly short story, like a novella, about a farmer who finds himself confronting a dragon and coming out the winner, and so becomes a bit of a local hero. It reads like a bedtime story, and it's enjoyable and funny because the farmer doesn't really try to be a hero, but things conspire to make him a hero. The Adventures of Tom Bombadil is a collection of poems supposedly written by hobbits and later put together in this volume. And I love that because it shows the way that Tolkien viewed his creative work. This came out in his biography as well, that Tolkien didn't really see himself as the creator of Middle-earth and all of its stories, but as the historian of it. And if he came across a plot hole in his work, his answer was, oh no, I need to go change that. He was like, you're right, there is a plot hole there. Or there is a, that doesn't make sense. I'll have to go find out why that is. And he would go and start thinking about it and come up with theories to explain it, as if he was trying to piece together a historical puzzle rather than make stuff up himself. So I love that Tolkien wrote a collection of poems that are written by hobbits and pieced together by hobbit historians, who include a preface at the beginning of the Tales of Tom Bombadil that explain roughly what era of hobbit history do these different poems come from, to the point where it says the latter poems in this collection were probably written by Frodo and Sam after their adventures in Mordor. And then when you read the poems, you can see that, sure enough, like the early poems are very fun and light-hearted and are interested in the things that hobbits are interested in, food and rivers and woods. And then the later poems kind of have this sense of sadness about them, a sense of loss, a sense of grieving and uncertainty about the future. So you read these poems and go, yeah, I can see Sam or Frodo writing these poems after they've been to Mordor. And I just think that's the genius of Tolkien. And then I read Letters from Father Christmas. This might be my favourite Tolkien book that I read this year. If you discount Lord of the Rings, can you ever discount Lord of the Rings? Let's say this is my favourite new book of Tolkien. Like the Tolkien book that I read for the first time this year, this was my favourite, Letters from Father Christmas. So for 22 years, Tolkien wrote a letter to his children from Father Christmas. And the early letters are more about, I hope you enjoy this gift for Christmas. I know you might have wanted more, but I lost some of my packages or something like this, but I hope these will do, and sending you lots of love. But over the years, the letters got longer, and they started including more and more stories of the things Father Christmas had been up to that year. And they also included pictures and little funny things hidden in the writing, and illustrations and notes, and sometimes interjections. So Father Christmas has an assistant called the North Polar Bear, and he gets up into lots of mischief and he causes lots of havoc, and he sometimes interjects when Father Christmas is writing about him and will make silly jokes. And this book is just lovely. So for every letter you'll have it typed out so you can read it easily, but there's also photos of what that letter looked like, photocopies of the letter, and all the pictures too. So this is a really beautiful thing. And I will say, if there are going to be any more Tolkien adaptations out there, and it sounds like there are, this is what I want adapted. Rings of Power didn't quite grab me. I definitely don't want more of the Silmarillion. I'm really happy with The Lord of the Rings. I wouldn't mind another adaptation of The Hobbit because I think we can get closer to its original tone. But if I could choose any Tolkien adaptation to have, I want this. I want Letters from Father Christmas. I want it animated. I want it done by the BBC. I want it to come out at Christmas. I want it to be adorable. I want to see Father Christmas. I want to see the North Polar Bear and the elves and the snow boys. I want their fight with the goblins. And I want it to be sweet and cute. And this is just Tolkien at his most sweet. And I really, really enjoyed it. It's really, really heartwarming. I mean, it's just full of a father's love for his children, seeking to bring them some Christmas magic. And he did it for 22 years until his youngest daughter was all grown up. And I just think it's absolutely lovely. And I'm so glad that I have this book, and I think I'll be rereading it every Christmas. It's amazing. And if you want to read any more of Tolkien and you don't know what to read the Letters from Father Christmas. It will just make you happy and cheer you up. Then the final thing that I read in my Tolkien deep dive was A Hobbit Companion by David Day. This is a little guide to hobbits based on studying the words and language tricks and jokes Tolkien put in to writing about the Hobbit and the Hobbit's culture. So you know I said that Tolkien put so much work and effort and detail into his creation, and it's so cool that we get to appreciate it and enjoy it now. This book is pretty much that. It's just a study on the wordplay Tolkien did in just his creation of the Hobbits. So not even like the elves or the dwarves or the huge big Middle-earth story. This is just about hobbits, and it's beautifully illustrated and a really fun guide to hobbit life and hobbit words. And again, I just found it interesting, and again it kind of just made me want to like write, which is a good sign for me. If a book leaves me wanting to write stuff of my own, I feel like that's a good book and one worth reading, so I enjoyed that. And that was my Tolkien deep dive. I've so enjoyed spending the year with Tolkien. He was a fantastic author and thinker, and I'm really glad that we get to enjoy so much of his work still today, and it was really good fun to spend a year exploring his stories and his writings. I will want to do another author deep dive in 2026. I don't know who it's going to be yet, but I definitely want to do this again because I really enjoy it. If you have any recommendations, please do put them down in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it too. We release new videos every Friday, so we'll see you next time. Bye! And I really like the idea in dropping books.